Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Thursday, November the 6th, 2025. Today, Venus moves into Scorpio, and you could argue that Venus is taking a big hit. Venus was in Libra, a sign which it rules, and also in Libra, Venus was in mutual reception by exaltation to Saturn. Now in Scorpio, it's in the sign of its detriment. So Venus is a great deal weaker, and I wonder how that is going to impact us. And that is certainly something I want to discuss at the end of this video. I also want to briefly mention the horoscope of Dick Cheney, the former vice president who died on November the 3rd. And he had heart problems through most of his life. I think he had his first heart attack in his 30s. He also, at one stage in his life, I think he smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day. That can't have helped. And I think that we can see his heart problems in his horoscope. And yeah, that is something I also want to discuss at the end of this video. But first of all, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching for today, which is Thursday, November the 6th, 2025. And here is the chart for today. And the moon is now in Gemini. So, it's moving into Gemini. So at noon, New York time, it's at 1 degree 4 Gemini. It moves into Gemini at 20 past 3 London time. So if you're in the Americas, moon moves into Gemini late morning. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, it's probably going to be very early tomorrow morning. But the moon moving out of Taurus into Gemini, it's perhaps not just important because it's moving into an air sign. It's also the fact that it's moving out of an earth sign. So, with the moon in Taurus, there was a certain amount of stability there. We understood what was important, on a material level, and now that moon is out of Taurus, it's back to a situation where there are no planets in earth signs, and it's going to continue for some time. Okay, the moon does move into earth signs, quite regularly, but when you think about, what the other planets are doing, right now there are, as I've just said, no planets in earth signs, no planets in Taurus, Virgo, in Capricorn. When does a planet move into an earth sign? Well, December the 15th, Mars moves into Capricorn, and so that might be quite a long time to wait. So what does this say about maybe the next month or so? There will just be times when there could be a lack of grounding, when maybe some people are acting on the basis of what they would like to happen rather than what actually is happening. And that might affect us as individuals, but it could also be about opinion formers and politicians and people who make important decisions. So between now and December the 15th, there just continues to be quite a lot of fantasy flying around. Okay, it might not just be fantasy, it might just be wishful thinking, having ideas, being very wrapped up in these ideas, but these ideas having no real basis in reality. So moon moving into Gemini, it makes a conjunction to Uranus, and this is going to be the last conjunction between the moon and Uranus in Gemini for a bit of time, because Uranus is about to move back into Taurus. And so we've enjoyed Uranus being in Gemini, the excitement of Uranus in Gemini perhaps, but going back into Taurus, we may have to go back over old ground. So this moon Uranus conjunction in Gemini, well, maybe we should just enjoy it while it's still around, while Uranus is still in an air sign. And aside from that, we have the moon is making an opposition to Mars. So what is happening is that the Mars-Uranus opposition that I've been talking about at some length. I'm not quite sure how that Mars-Uranus worked. I mean, I think we saw that plane crash in Kentucky, which seemed to be quite dramatic. I believe that was it a UPS plane, and it was carrying, I think, was it 17 tons of fuel, 17,000 kilograms of fuel. It crashed. People were killed on the plane, obviously, and people were killed on the ground. That was a very Mars-Uranus event. I mean, I did look at the chart of the Kentucky crash. I mean, it wasn't as dramatic as I'd expected, and so I'm not going to be looking at it. I know there's a bit of selection bias. Astrologers, by the way, are very guilty of selection bias. Not just astrologers, actually academics are guilty of selection bias as well. We focus on the charts that prove our case, or the studies that prove our case, and things that don't work we sort of just discard. It's not very interesting. So in fairness, I should have shown the chart of the Kentucky crash. I mean, maybe I will, I'm not sure, but take it from me, it's not as dramatic as it could be. One can always find something, but I didn't see anything that really stood out at the time of that accident. And aside from that, well, we got Mars sextile Pluto, so we've got Mars opposition Uranus still. We've got the Moon picking up on the Mars-Uranus opposition. So, in other words, the Moon is conjunct Uranus, it's opposition Mars, and we also have Mars itself making a sextile to Pluto. So Mars sextile Pluto is, potentially quite a dramatic aspect. We want things done. We want to make an impression. That is very important to us. And if we are not being taken seriously, some of us might feel we have to make some extra effort, really push it. Perhaps with Mars sextile Pluto we'll push it too far, but maybe not. I mean, the sextile is quite a fortunate and constructive aspect, so there is a way to prevail if we really feel it's important that we are taken seriously, that we do get our way. Then I think it is possible with Mars sextile Pluto. There's a lot of stuff going on today, by the way. It is certainly busy. We've also got Sun sesquiquadrate Neptune. So Sun sesquiquadrate Neptune, yes, is that right? Yeah, so the Sun is kind of moving towards the cardinal point, or rather the equinoctial. But the equinoctial point, what do I mean by that? I mean, it's about to make a 45 degree or 135 degree aspect to the Aries point, and Neptune is pretty close to the Aries point as well. And so Sun sesquiquadrate Neptune is a time maybe when people aren't too sure what they're doing, and there can be confusion, and maybe people can lash out because they don't know what's going on, they don't know what's happening. We feel we have to make an impression, but are we always going to be successful? And so there might be some danger of delusion and deception with the Sun sesquiquadrate Neptune. And then we've got Venus moving into Scorpio. So Venus moves into Scorpio, well, London time, pretty late in the day. I make it 10:39 p.m., but it will be earlier if you're in the Americas. And I think I'm going to choose today to talk about Venus in Scorpio rather than tomorrow, because there's just a lot of things to talk about at the moment. Activity levels are going up. So Venus in Scorpio, I'm not going to say much about it now because I'm going to talk about it later in the video, but the main point is that in theory, Venus very much weakens when it moves into Scorpio. In Libra, it's strong. It's in its own sign. It's in mutual reception by exaltation with Saturn, because Venus is in Libra, a sign where Saturn is exalted. Saturn is in Pisces, a sign where Venus is exalted. They're in mutual reception by exaltation. So Venus strongly placed, and then it moves into Scorpio. And straight away, Venus loses strength, in quite a big way. And I will be talking about that later in the video. So that's the picture for the Americas. If you look at the chart set for Sydney, Australia, The moon is earlier in the sign. Sorry, it's not in. It's in a different sign. It's in an earlier sign at noon. The moon is at 20 degrees Taurus. So, I can say what I like about the moon in Gemini, but if you are in Australia and New Zealand, the moon does not go into Gemini today. It basically stays in. It stays in Taurus, all day long, and the main aspects for you to consider if you are in Australia or New Zealand is possibly moon applying to a sextile of Jupiter, moon applying to a sextile of Saturn, and that can be quite a stabilizing influence, being able to perhaps balance Jupiter and Saturn. So if you are in Australia and New Zealand, it can be quite a constructive day when I would sort of urge you to think about what's going on in your countries, getting an idea about perhaps what's going on with the economy. I'm saying that because of Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter and Saturn as a pair are very much linked with the economy and the business cycle. And look around you. Don't think that it's all about you. It is about the society in which you live. So it is a bit of a difference there between Australasia and certainly the Americas. And then we turn to the heliocentric view, putting the sun at the center of the solar system. And so sun at 1432 Taurus, remember, in a heliocentric chart. Sorry, let me get this right. The Earth. You don't have a sun in a heliocentric chart because this sun is right in the middle of things. So let me say that, start again. So the Earth is at 1432 Taurus, and the Earth in a heliocentric chart is always opposite the sun in a geocentric chart. I know I say that pretty regularly, but just a reminder. And the Earth is making a sextile to Jupiter. So let's make the most of it. I have been positive about that Earth-Jupiter sextile as it's been forming. Mercury is also linked with it. So we've got Mercury trine Jupiter. We've got Earth sextile Mercury. And so, let's not worry about other stuff going on in this chart. Let's be positive about that. And I think that there are things going on which we can take advantage of. And if we think positive thoughts, not any positive thoughts, we have to think the right positive thoughts. There's always a right way to be positive and a wrong way. We can't just be positive about something that is irrelevant, is not important to us. And we also have to think about, the universe, where the universe is going and how the universe would like us to be positive. There are areas which can develop. And if we align ourselves with the fundamental optimism of the cosmos, then how can we go wrong? So let's really try to take advantage of that Earth sextile Jupiter. So let me now switch to the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for Thursday, November the 6th, 2025. Aries. Mars is still making that opposition to Uranus. It's not as exact as it used to be, but it's still there. It can still have an impact on you, so you should continue to exercise a degree of caution. And it could be argued that it might be stronger than usual right now because the moon is moving into Gemini. So when the moon moves into Gemini, it makes a conjunction to Uranus, it makes an opposition to Mars. So the power of the Mars-Uranus opposition, comes into focus again. So, over the next day or two, kind of depends on your time zone, when exactly that Moon-Uranus conjunction is. I mean, if you're in the Americas, it'll be sort of late morning today, Thursday, could be later if you're somewhere else, but just bear that in mind. And it's not necessarily the exact aspect. The Moon and Uranus are quite close wherever you are. So I think that Aries, you should be, on your guard, and you should be thinking about danger and how danger can occur, how it can crop up. It's not just about doing something crazy physically. It can also be about what you say. You might have things that you are desperate to say and you hadn't really thought through the response. Particularly once the moon moves into Gemini, you are becoming sort of more verbal, and with the moon conjunct Uranus and moon opposition Mars, you might want to be very clear about your opinions, but there can be a response, and the response might not always be desirable. And also, don't forget that Mars is starting to make a conjunction to Mercury. It's still a bit of a way off, but Mercury is slowing down. Mercury is getting ready to go retrograde in Sagittarius, and so retrograde Mercury making a conjunction to Mars, it certainly has a verbalizing influence on you. But the question is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, you can certainly express yourself, no doubt about that. But what happens next? Well, we don't quite know, do we? And aside from that, Mars, Mars certainly is in focus. Mars is making a sextile to Pluto. So Mars sextile Pluto is an aspect which can be about power, might be about your power and how much power you have, how much power you want to have. And Aries, if you want to have an influence, I certainly think you can have an influence. You're someone who can make things happen, but you can make things happen in many different ways. It's not always about sort of direct action or making demands. You can be subtle. Maybe while Mars was in Scorpio, you've learnt some of the lessons of subtlety, and you perhaps realize that there are many ways of achieving the same goal, and sometimes the slower way, the more roundabout approach, can be more effective. And overall, Aries, just don't underestimate your own ability to make things happen, and don't feel you have to do things by an absolute deadline. It doesn't necessarily have to be done like that. Now, going back to moon moving into Gemini, moon moving into Gemini, it can have many manifestations, but with this Mars Uranus opposition, Mars in Sagittarius, Uranus in Gemini, moon picking up on it, you maybe need to think about how you get to places, how you go from one place to another. And we're thinking about transport and travel, and I'm not trying to be scary or anything, but it's just the way you get from one place to another could be not as easy as you'd thought. So if you're in a hurry, well, you might be in a hurry, you've got some urgent appointment or whatever, it's important to leave plenty of time, because where there's travel, where there's transport, there is the potential for some disagreement, argument, aggravation. And if you're driving, just take it easy. Don't be in a hurry. Don't allow yourself to be influenced by the behavior of other motorists. One always thinks with driving that it's the other person's fault, the other party's fault, but probably in 50% of the cases, that's not the way it is. We can sometimes be responsible for our own accidents, and so Aries, take that on board. Don't feel that anything is worth rushing for. And it's not just about driving. It could be about going by public transport, even by foot, whether you're walking or running. Don't be in too much of a hurry. And so that's just something you need to think about, because I think that as the day progresses, Aries, you are going to become more hasty, and that hastiness can have a physical manifestation. It can also have a verbal manifestation. So just keep your cool and realize that you can have an influence without having to do anything crazy or dramatic. Taurus, there is a lot of focus on Venus, which is, of course, your ruler. And Venus is going through a dramatic change. And this dramatic change of Venus is really a part of this video. I mean, it's a part of what I'm going to be talking about, because, Venus is moving into Scorpio. End of this video, I'll be going into some detail about Venus moving into Scorpio. And the problem is that Venus was in Libra. And, in Libra, Venus was really very well placed. It was, in mutual reception to Saturn by exaltation. And additionally, Venus was in its own sign. So you'd think that when Venus moves into Scorpio, there is a big change, because Venus is debilitated in Scorpio, because Venus rules Taurus. So when it's in Scorpio, it is debilitated. It's in its detriment, to be precise. So maybe, Taurus, in some respects, your position isn't quite as strong as it has been. So if something had been working very well recently, there might be a sudden change. You may have to put in too much effort. Sorry, or should I say more effort? That's not quite the right way of saying things, but you may have to put in more effort. That's one possibility. Or you might just find that something that was working very well doesn't really work at all well anymore. So don't assume that things are going to stay the same. And additionally, Venus moving into Scorpio, it does move into your opposite sign, because Scorpio is opposite Taurus. So with Venus moving into Scorpio, it just might be a time when your power takes a dip. You have to spend more time worrying about other people, what other people are doing, other people's opinions, and that just might not be something you want. But it's the way it is. And it's not like you have to give things away. It's not like you're at the mercy of anyone. But you just have to have that consideration. You have to just be aware that some people might be stronger than you in certain situations. And the best way around that is to make some effort to understand, to understand what exactly is going on. And so, take the time to listen, take the time to use your sensitivity to work out, the best strategy. And, I did tell you that, things were happening. It is quite a busy day, and that's not the end of it. Venus is making a quincunx to Neptune, and it's making a quincunx to Uranus. So, that means that Venus, your ruler, is on the Uranus-Neptune midpoint. And, Uranus-Neptune, Reinhold Ebertin says about the Uranus-Neptune midpoint, or generally the pair of Uranus and Neptune, that it's about the elimination of the waking consciousness. I just love that phrase, elimination of the waking consciousness. And that might mean that there are moments in the day, Taurus, when you're not necessarily all there. You're distracted. You're a million miles away. And during those moments, you might not be as observant as you should be. You might miss important details, or you might make mistakes because you're a million miles away. that can happen. So if you're feeling this elimination of the waking consciousness, we all have it. I've got Taurus rising, so maybe there'll be moments when my waking consciousness is kind of threatened. You can make things worse for yourself by by drinking and taking recreational drugs. That's not something I would recommend. I would not recommend doing it anyway, but particularly with Venus on the Uranus-Neptune midpoint, that is not desirable at all. I mean, that could have very unfortunate consequences. So, don't take your general awareness for granted. You may not be as aware as you should be today, and maybe you'll miss important details. And some of these details may relate to other people's behavior. I mean, other people may do things that you don't really understand, you don't see it. And, it's possible, for example, that you could be taken advantage of because you just don't know what's going on. So in your social interactions, just be very careful. Try to really understand what's going on. Be as present as you possibly can be. So, I'm sorry to be a bit negative today, but, I think there is good reason to be negative. Now, on a positive note, you could say that Venus moving into Scorpio, may be a time when you can benefit from the right relationship. Someone who might be powerful, someone who might have a lot of control, but someone who means well. And, if you're involved with the right relationship, maybe things are going to work fine. And one way of looking at Venus in Scorpio is saying, well, you're in a situation where you don't have as much control as you'd like to be. You are perhaps having to play according to another person's rules, but that doesn't necessarily mean that other person is a hostile influence. And so do choose your friends and perhaps partners as well, very carefully. The right people can do you the world of good. Of course, the wrong people, well, it goes without saying that, they can be bad news. Gemini. Things are happening. The moon is moving into your sign. I mean, quite when the moon moves into your sign sort of rather depends on your time zone. If you're in the Americas, then the moon will be, in your sign, sometime this morning. It will move from Taurus into Gemini. If you're in Europe, then this afternoon the moon will move into Gemini. In Australia or New Zealand, it might not be till late in the day, very late in the day. Even into tomorrow. Certainly if you're in New Zealand, I think. But the moon moving into Gemini, in one sense, is good news because it does make you feel more present. You're able to think about what you want, and perhaps you're going to be sort of less distracted and be able to think about the things that matter. And additionally, I think that your ability to communicate is going to be good. Though when the moon moves into Gemini, it does make a conjunction to Uranus. It does make an opposition to Mars. So what that means is that the Uranus-Mars opposition, which I have been talking about over the last couple of days, it really does matter, and it comes back into focus. And so a lot of the warnings I gave about Mars opposition Uranus do apply today, not least because of a moon making the aspect. And so that may say something about how you behave, and you might really want to assert yourself. You want people to know you're there. Perhaps if you don't assert yourself now, you might feel that you've missed your chance, or that other people will get their way, or you'll be ignored. Geminis don't really like to be ignored, and so the question is, how far do you go? There is a danger that you do take things too far, and you have to also be aware that the things you say can certainly have an impact. They can have a big influence, and you want to make sure that you don't cause, unnecessary upset. And, with this moon making a conjunction to Uranus, this is a reminder that Uranus is about to leave your sign. Now, I don't know how you felt about Uranus in Gemini. I mean, Uranus has been in Gemini since, I think, was it July? I think was it early July that Uranus went into Gemini? I mean, this is just the beginning. Early July. Now, this is just the beginning. Uranus is going to go back into Gemini next year, and you had a few months where you perhaps were aware of what was possible, what you maybe should have been doing, how you could have been original, and you had a chance to think about it. And now that the moon is moving back into Taurus, you may, to an extent, lose that focus. And so if you are thinking about what makes you special, how you want to make a unique contribution, if you like, hold that thought, write it down. Over the next few months, there might be a certain loss of that focus. That focus was important, and you want to hold that thought, and you want to be prepared for next year, when Uranus does move back into Gemini, or rather forward into Gemini. And I think that, with the moon making a conjunction to Uranus, that is a good opportunity to think about, what makes you original, and, what is important to you, and, what needs to be said and what needs to be left until later. And remember that, Mercury is your ruler, and Mercury is getting ready to go retrograde. I mean, Mercury is going to be retrograde in a couple of days' time. And, Mercury is now in Sagittarius, and it's going to go back into Scorpio pretty soon. But before it moves back into Scorpio, it does make a conjunction to Mars. And that Mars-Mercury conjunction, it's less than 5 degrees apart. And they are really closing on each other, quickly, because Mars is going forward, Mercury is going retrograde. So you could say that it's a slow motion head-on crash between Mercury and Mars coming up, and I'll be saying a lot more about that. But I think that now you're feeling that Mercury-Mars conjunction, it's most likely to be verbal, and it could also be about other people. This Mercury-Mars conjunction is going to take place in Sagittarius, your opposite sign. And so, as far as relationships are concerned, remembering that Moon is opposition Mars, Uranus is opposition Mars, across the main axis of your chart, an axis that is, very connected with relationships. Just may be that relationships don't just take up a lot of your time, but also your energy as well. And the things you say, the emotions you express, could be important, and they could be impactful for better or for worse. Cancer. I've made quite a big deal about Venus moving into Scorpio, and certainly it's a big theme in this video. And, the question is Venus moving into Scorpio a good thing or a bad thing? I think that overall, Venus moving into Scorpio, isn't great, because Venus becomes, so weak, comparatively at least, when it makes the sign change. Venus, after all, is in its detriment in Scorpio. But from a Cancerian perspective, maybe Venus moving into Scorpio, isn't such a bad thing. I mean, Scorpio is a water sign. So when Venus moves into Scorpio, it's in a sign that you are familiar with. And you've already got the Sun in Scorpio. And, when Venus moves into Scorpio, in some strange way, you might actually feel better. Perhaps it's going to be easier for you to just pay attention to what's happening. Remembering that Cancerians use all their senses to make sense of their world, and of course that includes your emotions. And it could be that when Venus moves into Scorpio, you're perhaps in a position where you just find it easier to, open your eyes and open your heart and look around you and, see what's happening, and that can start to make things more clear. And you don't have to say anything. You just have to switch your focus from one thing to another. And in the process, with Venus moving into Scorpio, you might become more creative. I mean, creativity does matter. As a Cancerian, you have a vivid imagination, and Venus in Scorpio perhaps allows you to use your imagination in interesting ways, and you are able to look at things which other people either aren't aware of or just don't want to be bothered with. They might even be frightened of it. But as a Cancer, you can handle it, and you don't have to make a big fuss about it. You can just quietly get on with whatever you feel you need to do. And there are certain things with Venus in Scorpio that you perhaps decide that you don't really want anything more to do with. You know what's needed for you to be a whole person. You know what's needed for you to be productive and creative. And not everyone is necessary. And when you look at the Cancerian horoscope, it's always important to look at the moon, and the moon is moving out of Taurus, into Gemini. That's interesting because the moon and Venus switching signs, very close to one another. Venus moving out of a sign where it's very strong. Likewise, the moon is moving out of a sign where it's very strong. Moon is exalted in Taurus. Now moon is moving into Gemini. And, with the moon moving into Gemini, you just might realize that certain things have had their day. You want to quit while you're ahead. And that might be a feeling. You've done the best you can, and now that the moon is moving into Gemini, there's just less that needs to be said, and there might also be certain things you would like to avoid. And Cancerians can be very good like that. They can see trouble a mile off. And, with the moon starting to make a conjunction to Uranus, opposition to Mars, if something might go wrong, you're very aware of it. You can see it. You can see it developing. And so it might be a case, Cancer, of, valor being the better part of discretion. You don't want to be a hero. You don't want to confront something because you can see that there might be a confrontation. And so perhaps it's a time when you can sort of sidestep the issue. And of course, you being a crab being the symbol of Cancer, you're very good at sidestepping things. Leo. Venus is moving into Scorpio. I think this is relevant, Venus moving into Scorpio. And I think it has to be negotiated, quite carefully. You already have the sun in Scorpio, and Scorpio can be quite an introspective sign, at least from a Leo perspective. And when you put Venus into Scorpio as well, that may say something about how you project yourself, how you consider your overall direction in life, where you're going, how things are fitting together. And right now, with Venus moving into Scorpio, you might be inclined to be too introspective. Remember that when Venus moves into Scorpio, it loses a lot of strength, and this might say something about your work, your sense of direction, your business, if appropriate, and you might be just too inclined to see things in your own terms, and that can be a problem. You're just overly subjective. You look at things in terms of your own interests, the way you feel at a particular time, and you have all of this, and it's just it's hard work to be objective, and subjectivity can lead to all sorts of strange ideas and strange fears, and you might not want to take risks. I mean, it's good not to take risks, but some risks perhaps have to be taken. Risks where you might be risking your reputation, you might be risking rejection, you might be embarrassing yourself, but sometimes you have to take the risk. You have to, project yourself, and it just is a case that, while Venus is in Scorpio, this could be an issue. Of course, Venus goes into Scorpio every year. I mean, it's not an exceptional event, but Venus does stay in Scorpio. Let me just make this, let's get this here, for the rest of a month. And so this may say something about November, but November might be a time where you just have to make, a special effort to project yourself, because your natural inclination may be to do nothing, to keep yourself to yourself. And, you maybe should, avail yourself of, other opportunities. We've got the moon moving into Gemini, making a conjunction to Uranus, and this moon-Uranus conjunction could be exciting. It may say something about other people, what other people are up to, and maybe you need some variety. Maybe you need to be stirred up to some extent. So, don't feel that you have to do, everything on your own. And, if you're feeling bored, then some external stimulation, is available, though you don't want to take things too far. One aspect we do have, which I haven't really talked about very much, over the course of this video, is the Sun sesquiquadrate Neptune. And this Sun sesquiquadrate Neptune might appear to justify some of your inactivity. The Sun is, of course, your ruler. It's making an 135-degree aspect to Neptune, and 135-degree aspects are important, 3/8 of the circle. So Sun hitting Neptune quite close to the Aries point as well. The Sun is 135 degrees from the Aries point. Neptune is exactly on the Aries point. And so this could indicate a degree of uncertainty. You see something and you're not sure what it's about, and you don't necessarily trust it. And as far as you're concerned, this might validate your overall view. And it kind of supports the idea that with the Sun in Scorpio, you are being careful, perhaps even more careful now that the Venus is moving into Scorpio as well. And, if something is confusing, you might think, well, you want to stay away from it. But, where is the confusion? Is the confusion coming from the outside world? Or perhaps it's just coming from yourself and you being more emotional than usual about something. You're perhaps making it more complicated than it actually is. And so, perhaps with Sun sesquiquadrate Neptune, you shouldn't allow yourself to be knocked off course by something which appears complicated. But, if you really analyze it, if you look at it, maybe even if you confront it, you'll see that things are, more straightforward than you at first realized. Virgo, Moon conjunct Uranus. This conjunction between the Moon and Uranus is in Gemini, and it's the last time that we'll have a Moon-Uranus conjunction in Gemini for quite a long time, because Uranus is about to leave Gemini and go back into Taurus. And that matters for Virgos. Since the beginning of July, I think Uranus has been in Gemini, a mutable sign. You are a mutable sign, and hopefully Uranus in Gemini has been quite inspirational. It could have been challenging as well, but Virgo, it's perhaps shown to you what might be possible if you were to pull out all the stops. And now that the Moon is conjunct Uranus, you have a chance to look at things again, one last time. before Uranus moves into Taurus. How do you want to be original? How do you want to sort of do something that really stands out? This is particularly relevant if you're working from a career perspective, and you might feel that you do things differently. You're not quite the same as other people. You can be original, and Virgo has this unfair reputation of liking to do things in a fairly sort of straightforward and regular kind of way, and perhaps not being original. But Virgos can be as original as anyone else. They can be more original than anyone else, especially now with the moon making a conjunction to Uranus, and the moon is making an opposition to Mars. Now this opposition to Mars, well, the fact that it's conjunct Uranus opposition Mars, tells us that the moon is stirring up the Mars-Uranus opposition, and so you are confronted with a possibility. You're confronted with the possibility of really presenting yourself in a really quite dramatic way if you want, but it's possible that's not what you want to do, that you might want to keep a low profile. And it could be, Virgo, that the more you want to keep a low profile, the more difficult it is to avoid attention. You may get attention from people that you're not interested in. You don't want to be different, but again, it's a challenge. And if you can be different, I do think that that would be helpful. It is a time to be original. And don't turn your back on originality. It can be stressful. You may be exposing yourself to criticism, but you've got to be different. You've got your own sort of unique path, which I think that you really do need to follow. And one other thing, the moon, it does make an opposition to Mars. It also makes an opposition to Mercury. Now that opposition to Mercury, I don't think that's until tomorrow, but it's not really, maybe very late in the day if you're in the Americas, moon opposition Mercury. But that reminds you that Mercury and Mars are moving towards a conjunction. Mercury and Mars are now 5 degrees apart. Mercury is about to go retrograde. Mars continues to go forward. Mars is going faster than Mercury at the moment. And this could mean that circumstances could be running ahead of you. You might be thinking that you are going at a particular speed, but in fact, there are things around you that are going even faster, and you have to keep up. You have to keep up the pace, but you don't want to be overwhelmed by it all. And when that Mercury-Mars conjunction becomes exact, in a few days' time, that might make you feel quite agitated. You're thinking, well, what are you going to do? And are you going to just allow circumstances to take you over, and to just be at the receiving end of whatever is happening? And that's not the way it should be. And it goes back to what I was saying about the moon conjunct Uranus. It is important to be original, and perhaps to lead with your originality. You have a different view. You shouldn't be afraid of having a different view. You shouldn't be afraid of being original. Libra. So a lot of it is connected with Venus, isn't it? I mean, Venus is leaving Libra, leaving your sign. It's been nice having Venus in Libra, but the Libra season is over, and that's just the way it is. And Venus, when it changes sign, when it leaves Libra, when it leaves your sign, when it moves into Scorpio, it does undergo something of a transformation. Venus is incredibly strong in Libra. It's in its own sign. It's in mutual reception by exaltation with Saturn, and then it moves into Scorpio, and in Scorpio, it's in its detriment, because Venus rules Taurus. And furthermore, Venus is starting to move towards a conjunction of the Sun. I mean, technically, when Venus moves into Libra, it is under sunbeams. So what it means for a planet to be under sunbeams, it's like combustion, but it's not quite as strong. So I can't remember what the precise definition of under sunbeams is. It's something like if a planet is it 17 degrees? And I tend to 17 degrees away away from the sun or less. But when it gets to 8 degrees or something like that, it's combust. So Venus straight away moves under sunbeams, and that weakens it. And so Venus is not on good form. So if things have been working well for you, and if certain strategies have worked well, you shouldn't assume that they're going to continue to work well. And you might have to adjust your approach and accept that things might take longer. It might be more difficult to have an influence, and you shouldn't just necessarily assume that everything is going to go right for you. So, I'd like to be more positive, but we have to be realistic, and it's not just about Venus moving into Scorpio. It's not just about talking about the negatives of Venus moving into Scorpio. It's perhaps also saying that some of the positives of Venus moving into Libra maybe no longer apply, and you have to change your focus. You have to be thinking about other things. What other things might you want to be thinking about with Venus moving into Scorpio? You've already got the Sun in Scorpio. Scorpio is the sign which follows Libra, and Scorpio can be a sign that is connected with your finances and money, what you own. And maybe as Venus moves into Scorpio, you start to become aware of what you have and what you don't have, and that might bother you. But maybe it's a good thing. Venus in Libra can perhaps be overly positive, maybe ever so slightly complacent, and you've seen what was possible with Venus in Libra. And now that Venus moves into Scorpio, you're seeing the balance. You can't just be in the sunlight all the time. Sometimes you've got to be in the darkness as well. Light and dark do have to balance, yin, yang, and so forth. And so with Venus moving into Scorpio, you need to perhaps think about accumulation. You perhaps have spent your reserves. I don't necessarily mean that literally in terms of spending all your money, but just maybe emotional reserves, social reserves. Perhaps your capital is low, social capital, financial capital, whatever it might be, and it needs to be restored. And that's what perhaps Venus in Scorpio can do. So although it sounds bad, Venus in Scorpio, it needn't be bad. And what it's calling for on your part is a certain amount of realism, and you're not just sort of going off on a cloud. And you could go off on a cloud. Two aspects we have today are a quincunx between Venus and Neptune and a quincunx between Venus and Uranus. So if you look at the chart, you can see what's going on. You see there is Uranus and Neptune in a sextile aspect, Venus making a quincunx to both. So Venus is on the Uranus-Neptune midpoint. And so, with Venus on the Uranus-Neptune midpoint, things might not always be clear. And maybe it's because you're trying to manage this transition between Libra and Scorpio. It's not that Venus in Scorpio need be bad, or that Venus in Libra need be super good. There is a need for balance. But when you're making that transition, it's a very difficult transition. It's a very large, big transition. And in the process of doing it, you might well get confused. You might not, necessarily, understand, what is happening, and you might lose your sense of reality there, just for moments, but perhaps quite critical moments. And don't forget, there are no planets in Earth signs, and so if you've got there are no planets in Earth signs, except the south node, which doesn't really count. And you've got this Venus on the Uranus-Neptune midpoint. Something needs to come down to earth. Somehow you might drift off, and you don't want to drift off unless you're doing it in the right environment. And maybe you can do that. I mean, Venus, you could say that Venus on the Uranus-Neptune midpoint could be quite spiritual. It may allow you to get in touch with things which you're not normally aware of, that you don't normally understand, but it has to be done in a safe environment. You know, if you're doing something which requires a lot of precision, and you are having some huge spiritual experience, well, you know, that may not be such a good thing. But if you are spiritual and perhaps are, you know, in the mood for some kind of transcendence, yeah, you can do that, provided the environment, you know, is right. Scorpio. Mars is, of course, an important planet for you. I mean, Mars is your ruler, and Mars is still making an opposition to Uranus. It's not going away immediately. So it's just a couple of degrees away. And so with Mars opposition Uranus, you know, the usual cautions continue to apply. You don't want to do anything that is dangerous. You need to sort of assume that if things can go wrong, things will go wrong. I mean, I'm not saying it will go wrong, but you need to make that assumption. And it's probably, you know, not a good idea to be particularly trusting, and certainly don't assume that, you know, everything is fine just because it looks fine. You have to make an effort to really work out what is happening. And if something is wrong, if something hasn't been done right, you as a Scorpio should be able to understand it pretty quickly. You know, you're sensitive to these kind of things. You're sensitive to lots of different things. You're sensitive. You can be sensitive to spreadsheets. I mean, you can be a very good accountant and be a Scorpio. You just have a natural way for the way the numbers come together, and you can dig deeply into something and you know, see what's been done wrong, see if there are any discrepancies. So if you're in a mood where you feel there might be discrepancies, then look for those discrepancies, and I think you have a good chance of finding them, you know, if they exist. So you know, don't, whatever you do, assume that everything is fine just because it looks fine on the surface. Now, another thing going on today is we have Venus changing sign. We've got Venus moving into Scorpio. So you've already got the Sun in Scorpio, and Venus moving into Scorpio is probably a good thing. I mean, Venus may not be very fortunate in Scorpio. It is, you know, in the sign of its detriment. On the other hand, Venus is Venus. Venus is a planet of relationships. It knows how to get on with people, and so when Venus moves into your sign, that may say something about your abilities, your social abilities, your ability to develop a rapport with other people. And it's you know, it's in a water sign. You're a water sign, so I think that you may come over as an increasingly sympathetic person, you know, if you so wish. And you know, Venus in Scorpio may not be just about you. It may be about someone else, and you might see Venus in Scorpio as being another person who is in a kind of a weakened position. It could be but someone who was strong, powerful. They thought they had it all sorted out. Something suddenly goes wrong. Maybe they didn't need to have anything to do with you while things were fine. But now things are not so fine. They might start to try to get involved in your life. We might be talking about a fair weather friend. I mean, that is one way of looking at it. Is fair weather? No, well, no, that's not quite the right word. A fair weather friend. A friend who is your friend when they need to be your friend. So it's kind of almost like a bad weather friend, in fact, because you're talking about someone when something goes wrong with their lives, they get attracted to you. So you might find yourself being attracted to people who have problems. They just gravitate towards you because they think they can find you. They think you can provide a solution, and maybe you can. And just make sure that everything happens according to your rules, the way you want to do things. And if you're involved in a relationship, then you might find with Venus moving into Scorpio that partners, other people who you're very close to, there might be something they feel unhappy about, and it might happen sort of quite quickly. I'm not predicting disaster or anything. And if you have got people who are unhappy, then as I said, they will gravitate towards you and they'll be looking to you for support. And I think you can probably provide that support, certainly sort of emotional support. And, that's what Scorpios can do. Scorpios are very good at providing emotional support, if they are in the mood. Sagittarius. Mars opposition Uranus, still there, obviously. Mars recently went into your sign, makes the opposition to Uranus, and it's across an important axis of your chart. And so, this does say a lot about you and, your behavior and how you treat people, because now that Mars is in Sagittarius, you're feeling more active. You've kind of got some of your fire back, and you want to say things, do things. You can be increasingly tactless if you so wish. Sagittarius does have a reputation for being blunt, and Mercury is in Sagittarius. Mercury is moving towards a conjunction with Mars. So Mercury-Mars conjunction in Sagittarius may be about what you say, what you feel you need to say, what you'd like to say. And your words can be quite cruel. I mean, you don't mean to be cruel. I mean, Sagittarians just like to be honest, and that's the way it is. And so, over the next few days, as Mercury starts making that conjunction to Mercury, as Mercury starts making the conjunction to Mars, you do perhaps have to be careful what you say. But if you feel that something does need to be said, and you want to get attention, then really, that shouldn't be a problem. And additionally, today we've got the Moon moving into Gemini. Okay, it might be tomorrow, Moon moving into Gemini if you're in Australia or New Zealand. But the Moon moving into Gemini can be about other people, and the fact that there might be an increasing focus on other people. Other people can't be ignored, and it may be the case, Sagittarius, that you're not the only person capable of creating waves. Moon conjunct Uranus, maybe someone else making waves, someone else getting attention, and that would be particularly the case if you're ignoring someone. If you insist on ignoring someone, they're going to want to get your attention. And so, don't be surprised if something happens that you kind of weren't expecting, and the reason you weren't expecting it was perhaps you were thinking about yourself and your own needs, and you weren't thinking about someone else, and so that could be the issue. But also with Moon moving into Gemini, it just makes that Mars-Uranus opposition just that much stronger, and it really does create the possibility of tension, and someone wants to get noticed. Now, one thing I should point out, Sagittarius, is that Jupiter is starting to make a trine to Saturn. I mean, Jupiter's getting very close to this trine, but Jupiter is on the verge of going retrograde. I mean, remember, Jupiter's your ruler, so Jupiter going retrograde is something you should be thinking about. Now, Jupiter goes retrograde on, I think, about the 12th, so in about a week, but just get ready for it. And this Jupiter trine Saturn, which seems to be so close, doesn't actually become exact. And I will, of course, be talking about this Jupiter trine Saturn, very soon, probably next week, when they get as close as they possibly can. But do think about this as something that you can use. Saturn maybe represents some kind of controlling force, and maybe you need a controlling force at the moment. With Mars just moving into Sagittarius. It's great that Mars is in Sagittarius, but you don't want to take things too far, and you need some restraint, because if you don't have restraint, Mars in Sagittarius can just be like a straw fire. Something burns very quickly, and it burns so quickly that it burns itself out and there's nothing left, and you're thinking, well, what was all that about? And so with Jupiter trine Saturn, it gives you sort of more discipline, be able to take things in a way that is serious, and perhaps also to think about what is happening around you. It's not just about you, and I think there could be moments of selfishness over the next couple of days with Mars still opposition Uranus, and you have to think about where you stand in terms of the wider collective, and so do start to think about this aspect between Jupiter and Saturn. It's not exact. It doesn't become exact until next year, but still it's close enough for you to be paying some attention to it. Capricorn. Venus moves into Scorpio, and the question is, is that relevant? I think it probably is relevant. And you've had Venus in Libra for some time, and I hope that you've been able to benefit from Venus in Libra. Venus was great in Libra, in its own sign, in mutual reception by exaltation with Saturn, which is your ruler. But everything has to come to an end, and Venus has now moved into Scorpio. And Venus does move into Scorpio every year. It just can't be avoided. And of course, if you've got retrograde motion, it can move into Scorpio more than once. But I don't think Venus doesn't go retrograde in any time soon. So with Venus moving into Scorpio, that might mean that you have another look at your ambitions and what your ambitions are all about. And it could be that you take a more serious and intense approach, perhaps just an awareness that nothing lasts forever, that even ambitions, we can be as ambitious as we like, but it can all end in nothing. We're constantly striving for something, and it just doesn't happen. I mean, I'm not really into philosophy, but isn't it Schopenhauer talks about what motivates us? We're always looking for something. We've always got this ambition that we want to focus on, but we never quite get there, and it's all rather tragic as we move through life and never reach our target, and in the end there's nothing left. We've lost it. And maybe with Venus moving into Scorpio, it's a kind of a sort of a Schopenhauer moment where you perhaps become aware of the futility of things. What's the point of these ambitions? We're never really going to truly realize our ambitions. That's what I think Schopenhauer said. That for all of us, doesn't matter how great we are. There's always going to be a feeling that we haven't quite done it. We haven't quite gone far enough, and we haven't found the real pleasure in our ambitions. That's the idea, isn't it? That you don't just get what you want, but you enjoy getting what you want, and that's always so difficult. And so with Venus moving into Scorpio, that could be how it feels, especially this time round, because Venus was so well placed, and then to have to move into Scorpio, just such a change of gear. And a realization that one set of ambitions just weren't good enough, and you have to look at things in a different way. And that's really what it's asking you to do, Venus moving into Scorpio. You have to look at the broader picture. It's not just about what you collect in terms of status or money or whatever else you might be interested in, but it's about doing something that maybe is future-proof, thinking about the future, where it all fits in, and thinking about the great expanse of your own life, what's happened in the past, but also whatever is left. You want to fill those remaining years or remaining decades, whatever it is, whatever your life circumstances, it's still the same issue. It doesn't matter how young or old we are, we've still got a finite amount of time left. And, with Venus moving into Scorpio, you perhaps have a chance to think about what you'd like to happen. It's not about creating plans, having ambitions. It goes beyond that. And the best you can do possibly is not to worry about things too much, and maybe to take things one step at a time, and work out what you need to do right now to make yourself feel happier. And it could be that a change is required. You've perhaps got stuck in some routine. You've been doing it for a long time, and it's just not working anymore. And this is perhaps also the message of Uranus moving into Gemini. It's been in Gemini since the beginning of July. Okay, Uranus is about to leave Gemini, go retrograde into Taurus, but it will return to Gemini next year. And so this is perhaps a time to think about creating a life which is not just flexible, but can incorporate your aspirations. And an aspiration is something that goes beyond mere ambition. Aquarius. Venus moves into Scorpio. And the question is that a good thing? Now, I have basically taken the view over the course of this video that Venus in Scorpio is a bad thing. I mean, I know that sounds rather extreme. One is supposed to have some nuance and subtlety, but Venus is in its detriment in Scorpio. It doesn't have any dignity in this part of Scorpio. I mean, Venus does have some dignities in between 7 degrees Scorpio and 11 degrees Scorpio. Venus is in its Egyptian term, and then in the last 10 degrees of Scorpio, it's in its own face. So there are parts of Scorpio where Venus does work relatively well, but in those first 7 degrees of Scorpio, Venus doesn't have any dignity. So there's perhaps reasons to be negative. On the other hand, from an Aquarian view, Venus is moving into a fixed sign. It's moving into a sign that is very much related to your ambitions, what you would like to do. And I think that for you, Aquarius, Venus in Scorpio may not be such a bad thing. It may allow you to think about how you present yourself. And presentation does matter. I'm not saying it matters all the time, but with Venus moving into Scorpio right now, it does matter. Particularly if you have things you want to achieve, if you've got ambitions, you want to present yourself in such a way that you're able to maximize your chances, of success. And okay, it might not just be about success. It might just be about feeling good about yourself. And Venus moving into what is effectively the 10th house from an Aquarian perspective. Venus in the 10th house moving into the 10th house. I like to see that as the kind of the looking in the mirror configuration. There is a vanity to Venus moving into Scorpio if you're an Aquarius. And again, I'm not saying you're vain. I don't want to accuse you of something you're not. I mean, is there anything wrong with vain? I suppose everyone is vain up to a point. I mean, if people weren't vain, they wouldn't care. They wouldn't care less, what they were looking like. But to an extent, you might be, asking yourself, mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the most beautiful, talented, intelligent, whatever of them all. And so a bit of vanity might be important. And so, do think about how you are dressing, how you are presenting yourself, because I'm afraid it does matter. I mean, it sounds completely trivial to say that it matters. I mean, being someone who couldn't care less, but one has to read the astrology. And so Venus moving into Scorpio, can help you achieve your goals, whatever those goals might be. And at the same time, we have got the moon moving into Gemini, and making a conjunction to Uranus. And, this moon-Uranus conjunction and moon making an opposition to Mars, it certainly makes life more exciting. Moon in Taurus was perhaps a little bit boring. You found that you couldn't maneuver as much as you would have liked, and now you've got more freedom, and you can think about what is important to you, and also how you want to be different. You are different. You're an Aquarian, and with Uranus in Gemini, still in Gemini, does go back into Taurus in a few days' time. But while Uranus is still in Gemini, you have a chance to think about what it means to be different. And, you can be very different, and you can stand out. And it's not about trying to please anyone. I mean, I know there's a temptation to want to please people because Venus is moving into Scorpio, certainly being aware of how you present yourself. But, you also have to think about, what's important to you, and doing something different, really does matter. Pisces, Venus moving into Scorpio. Obviously, I've been talking a lot about Venus moving into Scorpio. It's the theme of this video. And as far as you're concerned, I think that Venus moving into Scorpio may not be such a bad thing. It may be a relief. Venus moving in through Libra, a lot of people have enjoyed Venus moving through Libra. But you, Pisces, you might have had your doubts. With Venus moving through Libra, it just could have made things more complicated than they should have been. And the reason perhaps is because, Venus in Libra it's such a different sign to Pisces. Okay, it's true that Venus is exalted in Pisces, so you could say that there's a certain sympathy between Venus and Pisces. And I'm not saying that Venus in Libra wasn't fortunate. I think in some ways it was fortunate, but perhaps it wasn't a good fortune that you necessarily appreciated. And when Venus moves into Scorpio, for you, Pisces, maybe not for anyone else, when Venus moves into Scorpio, it just could make things strangely easier, more straightforward. And, things just might become less complicated, because what's simple to you might be complicated to other people. And that's perhaps really is the case with Venus moving into Scorpio. You can see things, as they are. You're able to understand, the various, emotional currents, and what's happening, and also you're in connection with the universe and your own spiritual aspirations. And perhaps you're increasingly helped by the fact that Jupiter is making a trine to Saturn. Now, Jupiter doesn't make an exact trine to Saturn this year. Jupiter gets very, very close to making a trine to Saturn, and you'll be able to see that over the next, I think, week. It's getting closer and closer, but it doesn't actually make it because Jupiter's about to go retrograde. But with Jupiter trine Saturn, you have a sense of what is important, what matters to you, and you can be as as creative and brilliant as you like, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It could all, go nowhere, perhaps because you're complacent, perhaps because you don't take things seriously enough. But with Jupiter making a trine to Saturn, Saturn is an organizing principle. It's a principle that can really help you to, get yourself together and to take something that is important to you, that you enjoy, and really make it real and just make it a permanent part of your life. And perhaps that's something you can be thinking about as you get ready for Jupiter, your ruler, to go stationary retrograde. Additionally, we have the moon moving into Gemini, the moon making a conjunction to Uranus in Gemini. And, this conjunction to Uranus, it's also opposition Mars. And this Moon-Uranus conjunction could represent a disturbance, something happening that you hadn't necessarily anticipated, and you might feel that you have to act quickly in order to resolve an issue or a problem and sort of drop everything. And that's not necessarily a good idea. At the moment, Pisces, there are things that are important to you. There are things you're working on, and you can't be distracted. If you're doing something that requires a lot of concentration, or you're doing something that really matters to you, and you're really in the moment, and you're really feeling good about it, and then suddenly the phone goes, and you're supposed to do something else. You have to be able to respect yourself and not take sudden inputs, sudden messages too seriously. Yes, someone might need your help. Maybe it's a member of your family or something going on at home, but it needs your attention. But you don't want to be in a situation where you swing from one pressure to another pressure. You've got to, as far as possible, complete what you're doing before giving in to some external disruption. And so don't take anything too seriously, and give yourself the chance to be successful. And so that that means that there is this balance between the material and the spiritual. I think it's a day that can be very spiritual. Not just a day. Venus moving through Scorpio, stays in Scorpio for the rest of the month. I think that you're able to really get to grips with things and sort of get some insights about yourself and what you're connected to. So that's great. But you've also got other things going on. You have got your ambitions, and your ambitions do really need to be respected. And that's it. That's all I'm going to say about the 12 signs. Now it's time to look at things from the viewpoint of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Thursday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 5, which is waiting. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. There's nothing we have to do. We're just waiting for something to happen. We feel confident that it's going to happen in the end, but we don't feel pressurized. There is an alternative view that waiting is basically about the realization that something has to be done, that we're going to have to take the plunge. We can't be sitting on the fence forever. We have to make that first move, and that first move might involve a degree of risk. If you think about the I Ching and the kind of symbolism the I Ching likes to use, one of the symbols of the I Ching is the river. Rivers are important in the I Ching world, and the question is, how do we deal with a river? We have a river to cross, not a literal river to cross, but getting involved in that crossing is a pain. I mean, we're going to have to get into the water. We're not just going to necessarily have to get our feet wet. We might have to go in up to our neck. Again, not literally, not a time to be fording rivers, but we know it has to be done in the end, and we certainly can't delay forever. And we may also be aware that there is a danger coming up. A danger that we don't have to face right now. And as far as we're concerned, the bottom line moves. This is the very beginning of the action. Things might seem straightforward. We're just hanging around, waiting for something to happen, but we're not pressurized. But then we know that things aren't going to stay like this forever. They are going to change. And so perhaps it might be a time to be preparing for something. We know we've got to make the move. But we also know that things could go wrong. But we're aware of that. And that I think, does make things easier. I don't think we need to get ourselves into a super dangerous situation because we have that awareness. Forewarned is forearmed. Then, okay, the bottom line moves. Then the top line moves. Now, the top line is right at the end of a movement. I mean, it's right at the end of the hexagram. And if this hexagram is about waiting, then we just keep waiting, and we keep waiting. We know we've got to do something, but we just don't do it. And when we reach the top line, I was thinking, hold on, what you going to do? Maybe we wait too long, and we might wait so long that people send out search parties. There might be phone calls. Why? Where are you? What are you doing? And the hexagram talks about with this top line 3 uninvited guests, 3 people knocking on our door. I mean, I don't know. I'm not saying it's literally 3 uninvited guests. I mean, one view is that you're stuck in a pit, and 3 uninvited guests turn up, and you think you start off having a suspicious view of these people, but they're there to help. It's not a problem. Or it just could be that someone has to send out search parties because you've been waiting for too long. So if you have been postponing a decision and you told someone you're going to do something and you haven't, then someone might be in touch asking, well, what is your decision? Well, what are you going to do? You can't hang on forever. So in the end, you can't wait forever. And in the end, it seems that some action, is required. And with those 3 uninvited guests, there is a role for trust in the end. And particularly if we find ourselves in trouble, if we find ourselves to be stuck in a pit, help may be at hand. So 2 moving lines. That means we move to a second hexagram. And the hexagram we move to is hexagram 57, which is the gentle. And the gentle is really about trying to understand what is happening, what's it all about. So when we looked at the previous hexagram, we were thinking about danger, that there was a danger in the background. But where is that danger? What is it about? And the gentle is about understanding something. The gentle represents the wind. I think we've got top trigram, 3 bottom trigram. Both trigrams are about the wind, moving through something very quickly, trying to understand the cause, trying to understand the problem, if such a problem does exist. And we can get to the heart of the matter. And maybe that's what we need to do, find out what that danger really is. And of course, once we know what that danger is, we're in a position to do something about it. And now I want to firstly talk about Dick Cheney very quickly, and then I'm going to move on to Venus in Scorpio. I was going to say more about Dick Cheney, and I don't think I'm going to really go on to talk about his directions and transits. I was going to, but I think I'll try to keep things simple here. And I wanted to just look at Dick Cheney's chart first of all, from a perspective of his own health issues, not from a point of view that he was certainly a very controversial person, the arch neocon. I mean, some would argue that he caused a huge amount of damage and suffering. For example, his involvement with what was going on in Iraq, and I suppose to a lesser extent Afghanistan. And so arch neocon, arch interventionist. And so here is his chart, Dick Cheney. And the question with Dick Cheney is, but one might want to ask, is why did he have health problems? I mean, it didn't help if it was true that he smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day. I mean, if you smoke 3 packs of cigarettes a day for one stage of your life, and you've had heart problems all your life, I think he had a heart transplant in 2012. So he got to 84. So he almost got to 85. So he led a reasonably long life. If he hadn't have smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day, maybe he would have lived longer. I mean, I think he quit smoking some time ago, but I think was it 20 years ago he gave up smoking? I'm not too sure. But when you're thinking about the heart, what you should be thinking about is the sun. I mean, the sun represents the heart. It can represent the heart. And Dick Cheney does have the sun in Aquarius in the 6th house. Now, his sun in Aquarius is weak. I know it's not a good thing to say, but all things being equal, of all the 12 signs, Aquarius is the weakest, and Leo is the strongest. Aries is the second strongest. I mean, I know we're not supposed to distinguish between signs, but the sun rules Leo, so it's very strong in Leo. It's exalted in Aries. Aries, great place of the sun, but the sun is in its detriment in Aquarius. So not a strong sun, and it's in the 6th house. So the 6th house, does represent health, and then the sun is making a square to Jupiter and Saturn. So with Sun square Jupiter, Sun square Saturn, you might say that he could have heart problems. Now, a lot of people have Sun square Saturn and they don't have heart problems. But if you do have Sun square Saturn, you should not, for example, be smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day, and you need to really look after your health. I mean, I don't know to what extent Dick Cheney was overweight. I mean, he certainly wasn't slim, but maybe in terms of diet and his smoking behavior and so forth, he could have done a better job. I don't know, but I mean, I think that you can see a signature for heart disease in that horoscope. But I must make it clear, just because you've got Sun square Saturn does not mean you have heart disease. It's just perhaps a warning, and you need to, look after yourself. And so the question is, why did he die when he died? Was there any signature of death? Now, I've looked at transits, I've looked at solar arc directions, and so I don't want to. I mean, I don't want to do my usual thing. I'm not saying that I saw in those transits and directions, necessarily a clear signature, but I am thinking about his birth time, 7:30, and I was also thinking about the prime method of predicting death traditionally. So traditionally, the method used to predict death was in Western astrology is primary directions. So with primary directions, the idea is that you find the high leg, and the high leg, you spell that Hyleg, and the high leg is the giver of life. And if you know where the giver of life is, the logic is that when something comes along and makes a bad aspect to your high leg, and the high leg would be a planet, it kills you. Now, John Worsdale was an early 19th century astrologer, and he talked about this system. And it was his specialization in predicting death. I mean, he was, I think, quite obnoxious about it, and it sounds as if at times he liked to terrorize his clients. But this was not just John Worsdale. If you look at Placidus, the Primum Mobile, he's talking about predicting death. Other astrologers do it. It's just a standard fare of medieval astrologers, not just medieval astrologers, I don't know, what Renaissance astrologers, just to show that they could predict death. That was how they would indicate their talent. And so primary directions is when you move everything, when you move the earth. So you move, after you're born, you move the earth 1 degree for every year of life. And you look at what the planets do relative to the midheaven, relative to the ascendant, but also relative to the positions relative to the horizon where the other planets work. So there is a zodiacal way of looking to using primary directions, but there's also a mundane approach where you're actually looking to the horizon itself. So if you look at Dick Cheney, so Dick Cheney died when he was nearly 85. So you could say, broadly speaking, that if you move the Earth 85 degrees from when he was born, you can ask yourself, what are the planets doing? And so we take an equivalent. So, for example, 84, 85 years of life, if you take 1 degree for a year, equals 5 hours and 38 minutes. So 5 hours, the positions of the planets, 5 hours and 38 minutes after Dick Cheney was born, say something about his 84th, 85th year. So Dick Cheney was born at 7:30 p.m. And so if we cast a chart for an hour and 5 hours 38 minutes later, that means we cast a chart for 1:08 p.m. So if we do this 5 hours and 38 minutes after he was born, we come to 1:08 a.m. Now, in terms of his death, I was talking about the high leg, and we have to decide, what is Cheney's high leg. So the general rule is, by the way, people argue about this left, right, and centre. You might have different views about his high leg, and it gets quite complicated. And I would not have said I was a complete expert on this system, but by and large, if you're born in the daytime, you would consider the sun as your high leg, provided it's not in certain houses. So if you've got the sun in the 12th house, you couldn't treat it as a high leg. Likewise, if you're born at night, you would treat the moon as a high leg, unless the moon was in particular. So when you see that Cheney's got the moon in the 8th house, so because the moon is in the 8th house, you would not really regard the moon as a high leg. So if the sun and the moon aren't the high leg, and I know that some people might argue that the moon was the high leg, but I would have said that neither the sun or the moon could be the high leg, then you might take the ascendant as the high leg. And my immediate view would be to take the ascendant as a high leg. So in other words, when something aspects the high leg, that is, as John Worsdale would do it, might call it the terminus vitae. He would try to isolate one direction, call it the terminus vitae, the end of life. Of course, he liked to use Latin. I think astrologers like to do that, and maybe it's pretentiousness. They might just wanted to show how learned they were, but it kind of sounds impressive, doesn't it? This is a terminus vitae. So with Cheney's chart, looking at the main direction at the time of his death, it was Saturn on the ascendant, because 5 hours after he was born, 5 hours and 38 minutes after he was born, Saturn came to the descendant. So you can see this, again, going back to his chart. He was born with Saturn setting. Saturn was in the 9th house, but it was coming down towards a descendant. And so approximately 5 hours, 38 minutes after he was born, Saturn reached the descendant. In other words, it was opposition the ascendant. If we take the high leg, you could regard the ascendant, Saturn on the descendant, as his terminus vitae. Now, if you look at this chart, you will see that Saturn is at 8 degrees 20 Taurus, and the ascendant is at 944 Taurus. So in fact, Saturn reached his descendant. If you wanted to convert it to a date, I mean, I use the program Pi Marinus, pimarinus.exe. If you look up PYMORINUS, there is a program you can download. I think it works on most operating systems, and it's free. So there is it is, I think, probably the best program around. Certainly the best free program for calculating primary directions. And so it wasn't exact. It was about 1 degree off. Now, Cheney's given time is 7:30 a.m. So that might indicate that, I think the way it would work is that he should have been, if he'd been born, I think if he'd been born at, say, 7:25 a.m., sorry, 7:25 p.m., then Saturn wouldn't have crossed his descendant to 2022. It might have been more like 2025. And so it could be that he wasn't born exactly at 7:30, maybe at 7:25. Making a small adjustment to his birth time could have got Saturn exactly on the descendant, when he died. So I think it's good enough. And when we're dealing with primary directions, maybe we're just talking about a zone of death, sometime in his 80s. And in terms of I know a lot of people die in their 80s. He died at 84. I mean, my father died at the age of 84. My mother died at the age of 89. So, people very often die in their 80s. I mean, they die at any age, don't they? But I do think that this is certainly a significator of death, and maybe he wasn't born at exactly 7:30. Perhaps he was born at 7:25. That's something that perhaps we need to consider. So that's Dick Cheney, and I want to finish by quickly looking at Venus in Scorpio. And so here's the chart for the moment that Venus moves into Scorpio. I think that's the last time Venus moved into Scorpio. So this time Venus moves into Scorpio. There we go. November the 6th, 2025. It happens at 10:39 p.m. And so this gives Venus 29:59 Scorpio. So 59.9 Scorpio, sorry, or 29:59.9 Libra, which is effectively 0 degrees Scorpio. And so, when Venus is in Scorpio, you could expect things to be more difficult, and it may say something about the way people behave, people's attitudes, how constructive are people. So some people may not be very constructive with Venus in Scorpio. And Venus in Scorpio, well, in the northern hemisphere, of course it coincides with the autumn, and so it may be more poignant in the northern hemisphere. Still, I mean, Venus, for all of us, regardless of which hemisphere we're living in, it can be difficult, and it makes sense, logically. If Venus is in its own sign in Taurus, then by definition it's going to be in its detriment in the opposite sign of Scorpio. And it just may be that, if you think about it, Venus is the planet of relating, and it needs to have a certain amount of flow to it. And Scorpio as a sign is just fixed. And when you think about Scorpio, you might be thinking about sort of brooding and holding on to things. And if you're holding on to things, that doesn't really work so well with Venus. And you think in terms of obsession and control. And that's not really, what Venus wants. So, I mean, I think that there are grounds for regarding Venus as being unfortunate. If you look at the tarot cards, if you, for example, if you take the Aleister Crowley pack of tarot cards, I haven't really been involved with the tarot for some time, but with Venus, with Venus in Scorpio, there is a connection, there is a connection between different planets in signs and different tarot cards. And if you look at the Crowley pack, he talks about the Seven of Cups as being associated with Venus in Scorpio. And he calls the Seven of Cups, Crowley calls the Seven of Cups, debauchery. And I wonder about that. Is debauchery really a good word to use with Venus in Scorpio? Can we really see it as debauchery? I mean, I think one can if you see the logic of it. I mean, Venus, you could say, Venus is about perhaps enjoyment. And Venus in Scorpio is a particular kind of enjoyment. It's a very intense form of enjoyment. And it may be a mindless form of enjoyment. And I think, with Crowley and the tarot cards, the Seven of Cups tarot pack, I think he sort of sees sort of upside down cups lying on one side with water pouring over it. And it's a rather grim card. I mean, it's not necessarily a dangerous card, but we don't know what we're doing. We just get involved in pleasure for the sake of it. We take that pleasure very seriously. But pleasure shouldn't be taken too seriously. It shouldn't be debauch. But I suspect that for the average person with Venus in Scorpio, it doesn't really it doesn't really matter, and it's not going to work like that. And the reality is, lots of people have Venus in Scorpio, and it's just not a problem. And they're just ordinary people, living their lives. I'm sure many of you watching this have Venus in Scorpio, and you're surviving and you're prospering. And, when we look at people with Venus in Scorpio, it's very often people who are famous or infamous. And that's what I wanted to do now, is just quickly look at people with Venus in Scorpio. And it's obviously a sort of a massive selection bias there. And so let's start with some Russians, like Alexander Litvinenko. So Alexander Litvinenko was a dissident. He was a member of the FSB, I believe the Russian successor to the KGB, and he defected to the West, and he went to London, and he wouldn't shut up. He was just very full of himself. Sun in Sagittarius. Now, if you are a dissident and you have escaped from the FSB, you have to be very careful. The Russians and the Soviets have a long history of trying to kill defectors, and he had a very horrible death because he was poisoned with polonium, radioactive substance, polonium-210, and maybe that Venus says something about it. I mean, you could say maybe his Venus in Scorpio had something of a death wish. I mean, if you just behave as if nothing has happened, he continued with his criticisms of the Soviet regime. He did not keep a low profile. He met some people from Russia for some business meeting. I mean, that's not a sensible thing to do. And they put the polonium in his tea, and he died in this very sort of prolonged kind of. It took a long time for him to go, and in his case, he had Venus conjunct true black moon Lilith, conjunct Neptune. I don't have his time of birth, by the way. And so you might say that Venus conjunct those planets, says something. Says something about his death, and perhaps his attitude. There might have been something of a death wish. Maybe at some level he knew what was going to happen, and maybe he just couldn't control himself. I mean, he just couldn't be as careful as other dissidents usually are, particularly if you've defected from the security services. You really are taking a big risk there. Now, quite how he was killed, we know how he was killed, but who ordered his killing? Polonium-210 is not something you can just buy in large quantities. Okay, you can buy polonium-210 as a radioactive source, but in very small amounts. But for the kind of quantity that's going to kill you, the ordinary people just can't get hold of it, and it's made in a nuclear reactor. So that is what that there is the indication there that a state would have had to have been involved in it. And of course, everyone is saying, "Oh, it must have been Putin. Putin did it." I don't know. I don't know how it works. Obviously, someone in Russia decided to kill him, and they decided to kill him in a particular way. And as far as Vladimir Putin is concerned, well, Vladimir Putin is relevant because Vladimir Putin, remember, by the way, Litvinenko has his Venus at around 12 degrees Scorpio. Vladimir Putin has his Venus at 12 degrees Scorpio. So Vladimir Putin's Venus is also at this degree. And I think that if you're looking at Putin's Venus in Scorpio, I would have said that kind of very much feeds into how the West sees him. I mean, the West does see Vladimir Putin as a monster. I don't think he's a monster, by the way, but people in the West do. The concept of Venus in Scorpio being someone who is quite vindictive. Again, I don't know whether Putin is vindictive, but the Western narrative is that he is vindictive, and according to the Western narrative, you could then imagine how this man Litvinenko has defected, and Putin would be quite merciless according to that. Venus in Scorpio. There is something quite poisonous about Venus in Scorpio. It doesn't necessarily reveal everything. It is quite sort of vengeful, and it's one's sort of image about how Venus in Scorpio really might work, how it might manifest. So it's kind of interesting that both men have their Venuses so close to each other. And one's also thinking about with Putin. People are saying, oh well, if Putin were to die, Russia would collapse. It's Putin's war. Of course, the reality is Putin's a Libra. Putin is a moderate. He has done his best to avoid war and to contain the war, I think. And I know that's not a Western view, but I think that is the reality of the situation, and he's received a lot of criticism in Russia for being so restrained. But if he were to drop dead, one doesn't know who will take over from him, but one person who might take over from him, I'm not an expert, I don't know who might be in line, is Dmitry Medvedev. And so Dmitry Medvedev, he has been Prime Minister and President of Russia before, and Dmitry Medvedev at noon, when he was born, has Venus at 0 degrees 39 Scorpio. And if you have been listening to Medvedev is completely unrestrained. I mean, he really wants Russia to take over everything. He doesn't want Russia to show any mercy to Ukraine at all. So he's kind of, Putin is a good cop. Dmitry Medvedev is definitely the bad cop, the one who really wants Russia to go all out. Yeah, and he has Venus in Scorpio. And so when you've got Venus in Scorpio, you can be really intense. You can really take things very seriously. The former German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, she's still around. Annalena Baerbock, here's Annalena Baerbock's horoscope. Again, someone I don't have a time of birth for. Former foreign minister. She's a green Venus at 26 Scorpio, conjunct Aquarius, and complete Russophobes, one of the most belligerent German politicians in terms of pursuing the war against Russia. I think she's no longer in government since the last federal elections, when the Greens didn't do too well. But so she's got Venus conjunct Uranus, so she's quite into the war now. She wants to continue with the war, take the war as far as possible. Again, it's very strange for a Green, but that might be just Venus in Scorpio, how Venus in Scorpio works. Once Venus in Scorpio gets into something, gets obsessed about something, they don't necessarily know when to stop. And Venus in Scorpio can also represent something hidden, something that we don't necessarily see about someone. We suspect it, but we're not quite sure. And Bill Gates has Venus in Scorpio conjunct Saturn. I don't know quite how that Venus in Scorpio is working. There are all sorts of stories about his relationship. How he was having encounters, with other women, and he's now divorced with his wife. So. But it kind of confirms a lot of people's suspicions about Bill Gates, that there is something dark about him, that he's not just this sort of Microsoft geek, whatever, wanting the best for everyone. Venus in Scorpio conjunct Saturn, it represents something quite hidden. And notice that Bill Gates also has Mars on the IC. That Mars on the Moon opposition Mars on the IC. Okay, that might say something about the women he attracts, and may say that he married a woman who is able to look after herself and is able to fight back, maybe. That might say something about the divorce. So I think the Venus in Scorpio seems to work with Bill Gates, but we don't quite know how it's working, because perhaps there are still a lot of questions about Venus in Scorpio. And then you've got the Venus in Scorpio, which is just full out evil, destructive, murderous, whatever. And recently in America, someone who got a lot of news cover was Brian Kohberger, who is serving a life prison sentence in Idaho. He killed 4 students in their beds, pretty much. And he had, it would seem, all sorts of, issues, inadequacies. He perhaps was looking, it seems that, he had issues with women. He was regarded as being creepy. He was a teaching assistant. He was applying for a PhD. He was working towards a PhD at Washington State University, which is just 10 miles from where he actually committed the murder, I think. And so he has Venus in Scorpio, and so Venus in Scorpio, you can see how Venus in Scorpio can bear grudges. He can feel hard done by and feel that women have treated him badly, and perhaps want some kind of revenge. And again, with Venus in Scorpio, we might be thinking about revenge. That might be an issue there. And talking about the autumnal gloom and darkness of Venus in Scorpio, again from a Northern Hemisphere perspective, he committed the murders on November the 13th. When Venus was in Scorpio. So it's interesting here, Venus was at 26 degrees Scorpio when he committed the murders. And so going back to his chart, Venus was on his Jupiter. So in this, and on his Venus-Jupiter conjunction, Venus was starting to hit his late Scorpio planet. So it's almost like Venus had something to do, the Venus transits had something to do with those murders. And even more infamous from Kohberger is Charles Manson. I don't think much has to be said about Charles Manson, but Charles Manson had Venus in Scorpio, Sun-Venus conjunction in Scorpio. So Venus in Scorpio can bear grudges, and bear grudges against quite stupid things, like Charles Manson. Someone ripped him off, someone didn't help his music career. That was, I think, what the raid, which his gang did, in which Sharon Tate was killed, and Venus in his case Venus in Scorpio is conjunct the Sun, and when you've got Venus in Scorpio conjunct the Sun in Scorpio, Combust Venus represents someone's attitude to women. If the Sun is conjunct Venus, he could treat women very badly, and you might see Venus in Scorpio as representing a woman. I mean, Venus is a planet which can be projected. You could argue that Venus in Scorpio conjunct the Sun represented Sharon Tate. So that's Venus in Scorpio perhaps at its worst. I mean, sorry to just focus on the negative sides of Venus in Scorpio, but maybe next time I'll be looking at some people who have Venus in Scorpio who did nice things. So anyway, that's it with Venus in Scorpio. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy this video, I would be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.